The Abqaiq processing facility on the Saudi Arabian eastern coast handles approximately 7% of the world's daily petroleum supply. It is not simply a large industrial site. It is the single largest crude oil stabilization complex on the planet. A facility whose output feeds directly into the global petroleum pricing mechanism in ways that make any significant disruption to its operation immediately legible in commodity markets worldwide. When it was struck by cruise missiles and drones in September 2019, oil prices spiked 14% in a single day. The event demonstrated to any planner who had not previously been convinced that the Saudi petroleum infrastructure was not simply an economic target. It was a strategic lever of global significance, the kind of target whose disruption produced cascading effects that extended far beyond the immediate physical damage at the strike site. The IRGCN's operational planning staff had studied the 2019 strike with the institutional thoroughness of an organization that treats every executed operation as a data point for future planning improvement. What they had concluded from that analysis, what the intelligence community had assessed as a near-term operational concept for more than 18 months before the engagement, was that the strike's strategic effect had been diluted by the fact that it had occurred in isolation. The Saudi response had been constrained by the kingdom's reluctance to escalate. The American response had been constrained by the competing assessment of how to avoid a broader regional conflict. The isolation of the strike, its single-event character, had allowed the diplomatic and military response mechanisms to absorb it without triggering the coordinated action that a broader, simultaneous operation would have demanded. The refined concept was not simply to strike the infrastructure again. It was to strike the infrastructure simultaneously with a direct attack on a U.S. naval asset, creating two simultaneous crises that required two simultaneous responses, each of which degraded the resources available for the other, and collectively exceeding the immediate response capacity that the regional command architecture could address without the kind of prioritization that forced difficult choices about which crisis received the available resources first. The destroyer had been on patrol in the Central Gulf for 21 days. The carrier strike group that normally provided the aviation support layer for the Gulf patrol area was currently in the process of a scheduled transit. The carrier itself was 47 hours into a passage from the Gulf of Oman back through the Hormuz approach toward the Gulf, a transit that had placed the aviation assets temporarily unavailable for close air support missions in the Central Gulf patrol area. The transition period between the departing carrier's aviation coverage and the arriving carrier's coverage was a gap that was measured in hours and was managed through careful scheduling of patrol responsibilities and through the coordination of land-based aviation assets to provide gap coverage. On most days, the gap was manageable. On the day of the engagement, the land-based gap coverage was committed. Two F-15 sections from a regional airbase had been diverted to a developing situation in a different theater that had been assessed as higher priority than the routine Gulf patrol coverage, and the replacement aviation assets were not yet in position. The destroyer was the only major combat asset in the Central Gulf patrol area when the attack began, and the attack began in two places simultaneously. At 2:44 a.m., the ship's radar picture and the electronic warfare system registered inbound contacts from the north. 16 contacts, bearing 007 degrees, range 43 nautical miles. Flight profiles consistent with loitering munitions. C. Skimming. Low altitude. Closing. At speeds that place the leading contacts at impact range in approximately 14 minutes. The standard threat profile. The standard engagement sequence. At 2:44 a.m. and 17 seconds after the first radar contacts appeared, the ship's communication system received an emergency transmission from the 5th Fleet Operations Center. The transmission was brief and specific. A large-scale missile and drone attack had been launched against the Abqaiq processing facility. Multiple inbound contacts, attack in progress. Saudi air defense assets were engaged. Request for available USAO aviation support in the region. Two simultaneous events. the destroyer's own inbound contacts to the north, the Abqaiq attack to the west-southwest, approximately 240 nautical miles from the ship's current position. The aviation assets that would normally have been the natural response mechanism for either crisis, the carrier air wing, the land-based F-15 sections, were not available. The destroyer was simultaneously the only surface combatant in the patrol area and the only asset in the region that was not already committed to another crisis or in transit. The CIC at 2:44 a.m. carried the specific quality of a space that knows something serious has just been confirmed. The watch team had been monitoring the Gulf Patrol sector's ambient picture for 4.5 hours at that point. The controlled, focused alertness of an experienced crew in the final hours of a night watch. Their pattern recognition calibrated to the sector's normal characteristics and primed for the deviation that would not look like a deviation until it was already significant. When the radar picture delivered 16 contacts from the north simultaneously with the communication system delivering the Abqaiq transmission, the transition from ambient monitoring to full combat engagement happened in the time it took the TAO to call the first alert. There was no gap between the two pieces of information. They arrived within 17 seconds of each other, and the watch team processed them in parallel. The radar operator and the weapons officer and the combat systems officer, working the inbound contacts picture, while the communications officer parsed the 5th Fleet transmission and passed its essential content to the TAO in the compressed, information-dense format that naval communication training produces. Two situations, 17 seconds apart, requiring simultaneous processing by a team that was designed for single crisis management at full capacity. What the simultaneous arrival told the TO, before the commanding officer had spoken a word about it, was that the timing was not coincidental. 17 seconds of separation between a strike on the world's largest oil processing facility and 16 inbound contacts in the patrol sector was not the signature of two independent operations. It was the signature of one operation with two theaters, timed to overlap. The TAO filed that assessment in the background of his attention, where it could inform his decisions without consuming the cognitive bandwidth that the 16 inbound contacts required, and he went to work on the engagement. The commanding officer reviewed both situations in the 12 seconds between the 5th Fleet transmission and his first engagement call. The Abqaiq attack was beyond the destroyer's ability to respond to directly. 240 nautical miles was outside the ship's weapons range for any system in its inventory, and the ship was already managing its own inbound contact sequence. The Abqaiq attack would have to be addressed by the Saudi air defense architecture and by whatever regional aviation could be repositioned in time. The destroyer's decision space was its own engagement, and its own engagement required his full attention. But the timing was not coincidental, and the commanding officer understood that. The 16 inbound contacts to the north had been launched at the moment, within 17 seconds of the Abqaiq attack's initiation. The coordination was designed. The two attacks were not parallel independent operations. They were a single operation with two simultaneous theaters, designed so that the strategic crisis at Abqaiq consumed the regional command's attention and aviation resources at exactly the moment when the destroyer's organic defensive capability was being tested to its maximum by 16 inbound contacts in the Gulf. The destroyer was fighting alone. Well, that was the design. The engagement began at 2:45 a.m. with the outer ring. 4 SM-6 interceptors from the forward VLS cells, the TAO's choice of SM-6 over SM-2, driven by the same active seeker reasoning that previous degraded environment engagements had established as sound practice, when the formation was operating without the illuminator resource advantages that multiple cooperating ships provided. 4 SM-6 in a 2-second ripple. 2 contacts eliminated at 36 nautical miles. 1 SM-6 miss. The contact's terminal evasion maneuver at range exceeding the SM-6's correction capability at that intercept geometry. 1 SM-6 contact elimination at 32 nautical miles. 13 contacts remaining. 12 minutes to impact. At 2:46 a.m. and 31 seconds, the 5th Fleet Operations Center transmitted an updated status report on the Abqaiq attack. The facility had taken multiple impacts. The specific damage assessment was not yet complete, but initial reporting indicated Strikes on the stabilization columns in the facility's central processing section, the same section that had sustained the majority of damage in the 2019 attack. The Saudi air defense engagement was still in progress. Multiple inbound contacts still active over Saudi territory. The request for U.S. aviation support had been elevated to the theater command level. The update reached the CIC watch team's awareness through the communication monitor without directly interrupting the engagement sequence. The TAO did not look away from his display. The watch team did not pause. The information was received, registered, and filed in the background of the operational picture that the watch team was managing, relevant to the commanding officer's strategic situational awareness, not relevant to the next engagement decision, which was the SM-2 allocation against the 13 remaining contacts, now at 25 nautical miles. 4 SM-2 interceptors launched. 3 intercepts confirmed at 22 and 19 nautical miles. 1 SM-2 miss. The contact had descended to approximately 4 meters altitude. The sea surface return clutter in the pre-dawn Gulf conditions partially masking the contact's radar return and compromising the fire control solution at the moment of intercept. 10 contacts remaining. The ship was fighting 16 contacts with no supporting assets, no aviation overwatch, no escorting surface combatant to share the engagement load. The VLS inventory was depleting against a contact count that required continued investment of interceptors at each engagement layer. The mathematics of a single ship defending against 16 contacts without the multiplication of effect that a multi-ship formation provided was visible in the engagement log. The per-contact interceptor expenditure running at rates that the standard single-ship engagement protocols had not been optimized for. Because single-ship defense against 16 simultaneous contacts was not the standard scenario for which the protocols had been designed. At 2:48 a.m., while the SM-2 engagement against the outer ring survivors was resolving and the ESSM fire control solutions for the inner ring were building, the 5th Fleet Operations Center transmitted a second update on the Abqaiq situation. The update reached the CIC on the secondary communication monitor and was processed by the communications officer without interrupting the engagement sequence. The TAO received the update in a 3-word summary from the communications officer. Abqaiq. Multiple impacts confirmed. He acknowledged with a single nod and did not look away from his display. The 12 minutes of the engagement were 12 minutes during which 2 parallel operational threads were running simultaneously in the CIC. The primary thread was the engagement, the fire control solutions, the interceptor allocations, the track updates, the engagement confirmation reports, the continuous forward-loading of the next decision before the current decision had fully resolved. The secondary thread was the situational awareness of what was happening 240 nautical miles away. The awareness that the attack the destroyer was defending against was one half of an operation, whose other half was producing a strategic outcome that would affect global petroleum supply for weeks, that was consuming the theater command's attention and resources, and that had been specifically designed to ensure that the destroyer's engagement was fought without the aviation and formation support that would normally have been available. The watch team did not talk about the secondary thread. They did not need to. It was present in the room in the way that relevant information is present in a professional environment. Acknowledged without being spoken. Understood without requiring articulation. A shared situational awareness that did not need to be expressed to be operative. They were fighting alone because the attack had been designed to ensure they fought alone, and they were fighting it anyway, which was the only available response to fighting alone. The ESSM engagement opened at 16 nautical miles. 5 contacts allocated, 2 ESSMs, each against the 2 leading contacts in the formation, 1 ESSM against the 3rd contact. The ESSM guidance performed cleanly against the inner ring contacts at ranges where the fire control solution quality was higher than the degraded by distance solutions of the outer ring. 4 ESSM intercepts confirmed. 1 ESSM miss at 9 nautical miles. The contacts bearing deviation in the terminal phase, moving it outside the lethal radius. 5 contacts remaining inside 9 nautical miles. 5 contacts for the CIWS forward mount, and whatever ESSM rounds the fire control system could sequence in the time available. 2 more ESSM launches against the leading contacts at 7 and 6 nautical miles. First ESSM confirmed at 6.4 nautical miles. Second ESSM confirmed at 5 nautical miles. 3 contacts remaining inside 5 nautical miles. The CIWS forward mount was in automatic engagement mode and had been tracking the 3 remaining contacts since they entered its acquisition range at approximately 4 miles. The engagement at 3 miles, 2 miles, 1 mile. The sequence of burst engagements that the CIWS executed against each contact in priority order. The fire control computer managing the engagement queue faster than any verbal account could follow. First contact eliminated at 2.8 nautical miles. Second contact at 1.9 nautical miles. Third contact, the last, at 960 meters. 960 meters. The CIWS burst had required a tracking correction at 800 meters, as the contact executed a terminal bearing deviation, the correction taking 1.4 seconds, and the second burst opening at the revised bearing as the contact crossed the 960-meter threshold. Contact eliminated. At 2:56 a.m. and 41 seconds, the radar picture to the north was clear. 12 minutes and 1 second from first contact detection to last CIWS engagement. 16 contacts engaged across SM6, SM2, ESSM, and CIWS layers. 0 hull strikes. 0 personnel casualties. The commanding officer's first call after the engagement completion was not the post-engagement damage assessment. It was to the 5th Fleet Operations Center, with a weapons inventory status report and an offer to reposition the ship to a bearing that improved its strategic positioning relative to the Abqaiq situation. Not close enough to engage anything at 240 nautical miles, but positioned to cover any follow-on maritime attack vector that the broader operation might incorporate. The 5th Fleet Operations Center acknowledged the weapons status report and directed the ship to hold its current patrol sector. The Abqaiq situation was being managed at the theater command level, with the Saudi air defense architecture and with the repositioning of land-based aviation assets that was now underway after the initial diversion had been resolved. The destroyer was not needed at Abqaiq. It was needed in the Central Gulf Patrol Sector, where the 16 inbound contacts had just confirmed that the sector remained actively contested. The post-engagement weapons expenditure summary was transmitted to 5th Fleet along with the contact report. 4 SM6 interceptors, 4 SM2 interceptors, 7 ESSM interceptors, approximately 3,400 rounds of 20mm CIWS. Total interceptor cost, approximately $49 million. The Abqaiq damage assessment, completed over the following 18 hours and shared through the theater intelligence channels, was more extensive than the initial reporting had indicated. 7 of the facility's stabilization columns had sustained direct or near-direct impacts. The processing throughput reduction was estimated at approximately 35% of pre-attack capacity, with a restoration timeline of 4 to 6 weeks for partial recovery and 8 to 14 weeks for full restoration. The global petroleum market's response when trading opened was a 14% price increase that stabilized over the following week, as the scope of the damage was more precisely assessed and the restoration timeline was communicated to commodity markets. The simultaneous operation had produced the strategic effect that its planners had designed. The destroyer's defensive engagement had been successful. No hull strikes, no losses. The patrol sector maintained. The Abqaiq attack had also partially succeeded. Significant damage to the facility, measurable reduction in output, market impact. The 2 operations, executed simultaneously, had each degraded the other's counter-response by consuming the regional command's attention and resources simultaneously. The post-engagement analysis at 5th Fleet identified the simultaneous attack design as the operationally significant innovation. Not the technical characteristics of either individual attack, but the deliberate pairing of a maritime surface attack with a strategic infrastructure strike, in a way that forced the regional command to manage 2 crises with a resource base designed for 1. The analysis recommended increased persistent aviation coverage during the carrier transition periods, faster repositioning protocols for land-based aviation gap coverage, and a revised patrol coordination architecture that provided surface combatant mutual support during high-threat windows. Each recommendation was sound. Each had been identified before in various forms in previous after-action analyses. The recommendations had been noted and partially implemented and partially deferred, as recommendations always were in the face of competing priorities and finite resources. The IRGCN's planners had read the previous analyses, or had reached the same conclusions independently through their own operational assessment, and had acted on what the recommendations acknowledged, that the transition periods and the coverage gaps and the single ship patrol windows were real, that real gaps could be exploited, that the strategic effect of simultaneous multi-domain operations exceeded the sum of their individual effects. The destroyer held its patrol sector. The VLS cells were depleted and would require a logistics rendezvous within the next 24 hours before the next high-threat period. The crew ran their post-engagement maintenance cycle, submitted their documentation, ate their meals at the intervals the watch schedule permitted, and continued the patrol. 49 miles to the west, the oil futures market was already pricing in the supply disruption. In London and Singapore and New York, traders were looking at charts and making calculations. In the Gulf, a destroyer was looking at a radar picture and making a different kind of calculation, the kind that is expressed not in dollars per barrel, but in interceptors per contact and miles of separation between a hull and the last thing that tried to reach it. 960 meters. The width of the gap between what happened and what could have happened, measured in the only unit that mattered to the people who had just spent 12 minutes holding the line while the world's attention was 3 degrees to the southwest and 4,000 feet up in the smoke over Abqaiq. They had held it, alone. That was the record. The Gulf kept no other kind.